Hi, I'm Erin, and welcome to Unlikely Grace. This episode is part of a special series called Shifting Saints, exploring the changing ideal of holiness through Christian history. It's actually a culminating project for a seminary class I'm taking right now, and I thought I'd share it here with you on the podcast. So, these episodes won't follow our usual model for scripture meditation, but rather, I'd like us to take a journey through time, tracing the thread of what it looked like to live a life of complete devotion to God. For better or for worse, how has consecration been defined? And who were the ones held up as heroes of the faith? We've made it to our sixth and final installment in this church history series, looking at heroes of the faith through the ages. Today, we're going to take a look at missionaries. Now, perhaps you've just assumed that global missions has always been a preoccupation for Christians, ever since the words of Acts 1:8 were penned when Jesus said, "You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in all Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth." But in reality, the Great Commission kind of lay dormant and wasn't rediscovered until the 18th century. Of course, Christians had always taken their faith with them if and when they moved around, but moving for the sake of carrying their faith wasn't really a big deal until global travel became more accessible and theology changed in ways that created this urgency to go. To get an idea of this shift, this explosion in missionary efforts, consider that in the year 1750, the world was about 22% Christian, and there was scripture in 60 different languages. A century and a half later, in 1900, the world was 34% Christian, and scripture could be found in 537 languages. Now, in many ways, missions followed closely on the heels of empires expanding, and it's rather intertwined, unfortunately, with colonialism. Before Protestants ever caught a vision for foreign missions, the Jesuits were eager to take the Catholic faith to continents where Spanish and Portuguese traders and explorers had already made inroads. In these missionary efforts, imperialism and missions were very closely aligned. Later Protestant missionaries, though also doing cultural damage of their own in many places, were usually more focused on bringing faith than in extending their nation's political reach. One of the first Protestant groups to really catch a vision for missionary work were the Moravians. Their efforts, however, focused more on creating kind of these insular outpost communities of believers rather than on integrating into foreign cultures. With the Great Awakening and the rise of Pietism, there was a shift toward faith becoming more experiential, and people were gathering in small groups for Bible studies. This emphasis on personal conversion led to a desire to evangelize those who hadn't heard the gospel, to give them the opportunity to respond to Christ's invitation of salvation. The 19th century was also characterized by the idea that society was getting better and better. There was a post-millennial optimism that believed that Christians could work towards ushering in God's kingdom and Christ's return. And theology was changing. The earlier reformers had assumed the Great Commission was only for the apostolic age. But now, believers began reading Christ's command as one given to them personally. The world was opening up. People were more globally conscious as the voyages of famous explorers lit a flame of curiosity about other places and people. William Carey, who was referred to as the father of modern missions, was actually inspired by the writings of Captain Cook. New organizations that centered on mission work began to spring up. These missionary societies were made up of Christians from divergent denominations who shared a common zeal for global evangelism. And this narrow focus on missions allowed for cooperation among churches and denominations who wouldn't normally find much common ground. I feel like this episode sort of brings me to an era that I can relate to. Martyrs and mystics, monastics and scholastics might not be so relatable to me. To be clear, these shifting ideals of holiness are not relegated just to certain eras that I've assigned them to. As we've traced this theme of consecration, it's important to remember there's a lot of overlap. Martyrs, for example, didn't cease to exist after Constantine. There are still Christians in the world today facing death because of their faith. But this era of global missions brings us to a theme I just feel more familiar with. I can well remember our missionary bulletin board on the wall of my childhood church. These couples and families were household names for our members, celebrities of a sort. In some cases, they had given up a lot to go and live and serve in a foreign place, and they were revered as superheroes of the faith, the ones who were really and truly committed to Christ. I think that sentiment still lingers in churches today. Perhaps with the dawn of social media, we've moved more towards idolizing megachurch pastors and influencers instead. I don't say any of this to downplay sacrifices made for the sake of the gospel. I just wonder sometimes if we fail to see our heroes in 3 dimensions. William Carey, for example, who we mentioned earlier, who is to be admired for his work in India and his unswerving commitment to his call. Yet his life is complicated. Did he do right to insist on his wife and children accompanying him to India? Did he do right to insist on staying even after his wife suffered from severe psychosis and had to live out her life confined to her room, separated from her sons who had been sent back to Europe? With any of these complicated heroes we've looked at over these 6 episodes, we have to be honest about their lives. There are things to be admired and imitated. There are also lessons to be learned and mistakes not to be repeated. So I leave you with this challenge. Don't fall into all or nothing thinking when it comes to those you look up to in the faith. And remember, what it means to live a consecrated life has too often been defined by popular opinion. The authors and pastors and musicians that we idolize today look quite a bit different from the examples of faithfulness the church has revered in the past. I love that verse in 2 Chronicles 16:9 that says, "For the eyes of the Lord roam throughout the earth, to show himself strong for those who are wholeheartedly devoted to him." Devotion is not just seen in our deeds, in the things that we renounce or the accomplishments we achieve. Devotion starts in the heart, when our heart is undivided and wholly committed to Christ. You know, when you think about it, history records the names and facts of a very few from church history. Imagine all the faithfully devoted followers of Jesus who will remain unknown to us until we meet them in God's eternal kingdom. And imagine the endless stories we will tell, not of our own faithfulness, but of God's faithfulness to us. I want to leave you today with these words from Hebrews chapter 12 that say, "Since we also have such a large cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us lay aside every hindrance and the sin that so easily ensnares us. Let us run with endurance the race that lies before us, keeping our eyes on Jesus."